Good morning, everyone. How are you, Max?
I'm very good, mate. How are you doing?
Perfectly. Perfect way to start a Monday. Who are our guests today?
We have the fantastic Simon and Charlotte from MMC Ventures in London, and I will pass over to them to introduce themselves and the fund very briefly now. So,
good morning. Great to be here. Hey, Max. Hey, Jamie. I'm Simon Menashy. I'm one of the partners at MMC. I'll say just a little bit about MMC, and Charlotte, maybe introduce yourself as well. So MMC is an early stage fund based in London. We've been investing since about 2000. We focus on European Series A, and our specialism is that we have an in-house research team and a research-driven approach, which means we invest in deeper technology companies, a lot of data science and data infrastructure companies across a bunch of different verticals. And we've been doing that for a long time. So we have one of the largest AI portfolios in Europe, which I'm sure is a topic we'll talk about a little bit today. Charlotte?
Hi, everyone. Hey, Max. Hey, Jamie. So I'm Charlotte. I'm one of the principals here at MMC. So I've been at MMC for coming up to 3 years now. I spend my time looking at a lot of our different verticals that we focus on, which we're going to talk more about. And I lead our kind of data-driven health thesis and tech bio thesis. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But more generally, I've been in VC for 6 years. Prior to that, I was at Silicon Valley Bank. So generally been investing in tech for about 10 years. And academically, I'm a scientist. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation today.
Excellent. Well, guys, I think one of the interesting things that you've already just brought up there is there aren't a huge amount of venture funds that have been around since 2000 anywhere outside of the US. And I know, Simon, you've been around for over half of that. Could you give us a little bit of the founding story of MMC, the backstory, and kind of how it's progressed over that, nearly 25 years?
Sure, and we're planning a big 25 anniversary party at some point, so stay tuned for that. MMC started in 2000. I joined in 2011, so I've been at MMC for about half the story, which is 12 years. But MMC really started as a project at a time when there wasn't a lot of venture capital around, generally. There were entrepreneurs, but it's very hard to raise early stage funding. And it started as a group of angels who wanted to be able to work with entrepreneurs, help them raise capital, but also be involved in supporting the companies in those kind of difficult early stages, which sounds kind of obvious, and it's what VCs do now, but at a time when there wasn't much of a venture ecosystem, there weren't that many people doing that. So Bruce McFarlane, who at the time was the head of the investment bank at Merrill Lynch in London, and Alan Morgan, who was the head of financial services at McKinsey, were the two founders of the business. Started with a group of people in their network and grew that to about 100 angels over a period of time. And then MMC started raising and managing outside kind of institutional money and money in a fund structure about 5 years later. We've scaled probably in the last 12 or 13 years, much more. So today we manage about $1 billion in assets under management in total. But for quite a lot of years in the early days, it was pretty difficult to raise and invest capital. And, there were probably, 10 early stage funds in London. And they were, they had between kind of 2 and 8 people each. So it was a really tiny ecosystem. And London was probably bigger than the others. So, MMC was quite early to the game.
And how did you, Simon, end up at MMC? What were you doing before that?
So I started my career in consulting. I'd set up an IT business when I was at university. I had studied physics and space research, which gave me a bit of an appreciation of building things and doing data collection, not just doing the analysis. And I went into consulting, did strategy consulting at Deloitte, worked with a lot of big tech and media companies who were always trying to innovate with technology, but to catch up with the people that were challenging them. And I got a bit sick of working for the slow-moving, always trying to catch up guys, and decided to go and work with people who could, iterate and experiment a lot faster. So I spent my time for about a year networking my way into venture. And, I said there were probably 10 firms in the market. They probably hired between 0 and 1 people each per year. So there weren't a lot of VC jobs around. And I was very lucky to find MMC, which, as it turns out, I didn't know it then, was going to be a firm that would grow very fast and give me the opportunity not just to progress as a venture capital, junior person and build my career, but also build a firm and build a franchise and a brand over a period of time, which is what we've been doing, well, for 25 years now.
And talk to us about because I mean, I first started working in the ecosystem in London in 2016, 17, and I've even noticed how much it changed in the last, 8 years. In that last kind of 12 plus years, like, what are the main changes you've noted? I suppose it's gone from kind of almost cottage industry to something pretty professional and pretty well structured, right?
Yeah, I would describe it as sort of cool but very niche in the early days. So, we started calling Old Street Roundabout in East London Silicon Roundabout. It was kind of just a roundabout back then. There was a groundswell of kind of cool companies in East London, lots of events held in like old breweries and stuff, and the early signs that people were exchanging expertise and helping each other and angel investing in each other's companies, but really in quite a small cluster. And everyone sort of knew everyone. It was all a bit inside the network. And I guess over the past decade, we've had just an explosion both of entrepreneurial venturing, right? More people. You couldn't really tell your mum 10 years ago that you were going to quit your corporate job and start a startup. Whereas now entrepreneurs are, feted by the world's media as some of the most exciting people around. And that's definitely been something that's changed. But also the scale of the venture capital world has changed to follow that. And where there are great entrepreneurs, money has followed to help accelerate what they're doing. So really the scene was very, very small. I would say today, I don't know, probably 80% of people that work in venture capital have started working in venture capital in the last 5 years. So there's some institutional memory, and VCs that have been around for a while have gone through recessions and downturns and the tech bubble bursting and so on. But there's also been a lot of injection of energy and new talent and different perspectives, and particularly entrepreneurs who have founded businesses or scaled businesses and then become VCs, all into the venture market in the last decade. So we have a more rich and vibrant and deep and broad venture capital community today than we could have imagined a decade ago, which is quite exciting.
Yeah, and on just a different side of perspective on that. So I think it was in 2014 I joined Silicon Valley Bank, which no one had heard of at the time, including me. I signed up to this bank that was kind of entrepreneur bank. They thought it sounded quite cool, but didn't really know what it did. And I think what was really interesting when I was there before, kind of, spending the 5 years there were about 30, 40 people when I joined. By the end of when I left, I think there were 400 people. And I think thinking back to kind of what Silicon Valley Bank did, right, it was supporting the ecosystem of venture firms, and their product set expanded with that. So supporting venture stage companies in terms of not just the equity, obviously helping kind of build relationships on the equity side and helping those companies, but also on the debt side, right, to kind of reduce the number of dilution for those companies to help them grow and attract more investors, and also bring quite a lot of the US ecosystem over to Europe as well. So, seeing that growth trajectory, which I think was in line with the general European growth trajectory of venture, was really, really interesting. Particularly, I think also the funds banking team, which I guess was a proxy for the number of funds growing, the number of GPs that are setting up here in Europe, as well as those from the US coming and landing here. And, to Simon's point, I think that will rise and fall over time. But I think the general trajectory has been really exciting and obviously continues to go up. And that's only going to self-perpetuate as like that cycle, the talent starts recycling into kind of the industry. So, yeah, really, really exciting, I guess. I think the past 10 years, just seeing that kind of growth curve.
And one of the things that I think I would suggest is a kind of law of ecosystems is that you start with the more obvious plays and then move deeper, right? Like if you look at the unicorns created in the UK in the last couple of years, it's not your Deliveroos and your Gustos anymore. It's kind of like layers upon layers of abstraction of very specific things for very specific like niche financial processes or biotech or whatever. And when you look at the the MMC portfolio, you've got a real mix in there, right? You've got like your Moobies and your Gustos and your Bloom and Wilds, some like great kind of household names of UK tech, and then also some Synthesias and Snowplows and Coppers. Like, could you talk us through a little bit? Would you say your thesis has reflected that maturation of the ecosystem, in that you've kind of abstracted yourselves as you've grown and matured, or are there other forces at play there as well?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about kind of where we started, and Charlotte, maybe you can pick up. I mean, in the very early days of MMC, there wasn't a lot of tech to back, right? And so, you'd find 100 entrepreneurial businesses, and they'd be in a pretty wide variety of sectors. It was very difficult to say, oh, I'm a specialist in A, B, or C, because there weren't that many ventures to back. And so we were pretty generalist in the first, 5 to 10 years of MMC. We honed in over time on two areas initially, which was B2B SaaS and direct-to-consumer internet businesses. Again, kind of sounds sort of broad and obvious, but at the time, verticalization of SaaS was a big thing. A cloud was a word that we were using a lot. Now no one talks about cloud because it's sort of obvious. And, the same with like internet as a category and e-commerce as a category. That was kind of a new thing. And it was possible at that time to build a vertical SaaS business and not run into 10 other competitors, or to build a direct-to-consumer brand and have an advantage and be able to build community and build an audience. That advantage has really gone today. I mean, you can't build a direct-to-consumer brand and have any kind of advantage unless you've got an existing audience or an influencer. Facebook and Instagram and Google and every other search engine and social channel is bid up to the max, and there's no advantage to be had really anywhere anymore. But at the time, you could do a lot by being really clever with digital marketing. So we probably back companies that created, $1 billion of enterprise value in that kind of early 2010s period where we were doing vertical SaaS and D2C. That advantage doesn't exist today, but it existed then. We realized that over time you need to specialize and you need to deepen your understanding of technology as technology changes in order to stay ahead of the market. And so we were quite early in 2016 in initiating a research team. We think we were the first VC in Europe to do that. And our focus really was to understand emerging technologies and how they were going to impact the areas that we'd been investing in and that we wanted to be investing in. And that really led to the creation of our strategy focused on AI companies and companies building data science in-house. We decided we weren't going to back anymore the kind of more vanilla SaaS, vanilla workflow companies, and we were going to only back consumer companies where there was something really interesting going on with their use of AI under the hood. And in fact, we phased that out entirely over the past 5 years. And then more recently, some of those supporting layers underneath that, like the data infrastructure and cloud hosting layers, have become more and more important. There's been enough of an ecosystem that we can, back lots of companies in those spaces in their own rights. So that, I suppose, has been the progression. And Charlotte, maybe you want to pick up on some of the verticals.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it kind of reflects back to what we were talking about a minute ago with the general maturation of kind of the ecosystem. So, as I say, 10 years ago, you probably didn't have the luxury to kind of pick and choose what you wanted to invest in. And I think over time, we see, ourselves from both a competitive positioning, but also how do we add value to the entrepreneurs that we're backing. We probably become more specialized on the technology horizontally, but then also how that applies to kind of verticals of interest at the same time. So we look at both. To say the sort of horizontal, what are the really interesting technologies that are ready, potentially commercially now to really be embedded within a bunch of different verticals. So, I guess the verticals that we see as really exciting are kind of fintech, data-driven health. And, for both of those verticals, for instance, we look at, where is the intersection of technology and those verticals in terms of the general macro trends, and where do we think there's going to be really big businesses built? And then more similar thematically, from the technology standpoint, looking at kind of the data infrastructure, the cloud side of things, and AI specifically with the enterprise, which obviously is applicable to a lot of different industries, but knowing obviously the technology layer really well. So yeah, and then I think that's only become more focused over time, which I think is helpful in terms of how we position ourselves in the market. So yeah, so I'd say that's kind of how we think about it now and how the thesis has progressed. And then within each of those areas, as a team, we kind of split those out, but also kind of cross-pollinate across the different teams. So, if we're looking at health business or selling to health customers, but there's a really strong data infrastructure play. A number of us with that expertise on the team, as well as our research team who knows the technology layer, will work together to come out with the best possible thesis for those businesses, and looking at all the different businesses in that one area and working out, what are the businesses we want to back and what do we think good looks like before going into those conversations. So that's a big part of where we spend a lot of our time. And I know we're going to be talking a little bit about how do we choose what investments to make, but I think that forms a lot of the backbone in terms of how we think about things and build up theses.
Amazing. And yeah, that was going to be one of my questions is you guys have got a head start on the market, but also I think everyone who runs a function like a research function or something kind of adjacent to the direct investment team. I think one of the classic things of venture is working out how to put those bits together, how to make them work symbiotically. And I think there's no kind of perfect playbook, but I'd love to understand how you guys plug the research function, which I presume is not spending all day every day doing deals and is more thesis driven, maybe has a different time horizon than whatever the length of any specific deal is. So yeah, how you plug that into the process. And then also how for you guys, as I would imagine as an investment team, you have varying levels of technical expertise, but you're probably not all like deep machine learning experts from a kind of like engineering perspective, how you guys get yourselves upskilled in the right way. So yeah, how you plug it in and how you upskill the investment team in that process.
Yeah, I can take this to start. So I think that there's no easy way, right? I think it's still something we continue to test. But I think what tends to work quite well is obviously close communication between the two groups. So within our research team and our investment team. So for instance, although the research team does not necessarily do new investments, they'll sit within our deal flow meetings that we have. So every Monday, we'll have a meeting to go through what the team is looking at, what are the trends that we're seeing at, the forefront of the market, right? And every week that's changing. And I think that's really important for her to kind of sit within that meetings, hear a little bit more about what we're seeing. She's obviously got her projects that are ongoing in terms of the areas that she's looking into. So, data infrastructure or the meta-modded data stack, which is a piece she just did. And so we're continuously learning off each other. And similarly, when she comes up with new kind of research, she always presents that back to the team. So as I say, I think it's the real close communication between the two groups, and that will continue to evolve. But I think that's where it's really successful. And then when she's spoken to kind of interesting businesses on behalf of kind of the team, looking at kind of their interesting areas and mapping out the market, then at the right time she might bring the investment team into those meetings, and then we can give a different perspective and by double heading those meetings. So we do things like that to make sure we're in touch, I guess, between the two groups. So that's a little bit of a flavour of how we work together.
I'm curious to know, Charlotte, Simon, how both of you learn. Because I think this is one of the things that sometimes, I wouldn't use the word struggle, but I think that as a VC, you need to be really careful with the schedule. And you can be in back-to-back calls every single day and not have enough time to read, to sit down, to think. How do both of you approach this, and how does that tie into what the research team does?
Yeah, no. So I think for me, and I think personally, if you speak to each person in the team, everyone has a slightly different answer, which I think is a good thing. Yeah. Right. But in terms of what you said around having really sort of time to think and to kind of step back and, observe and just think a little bit more about what you've seen in the market or certain kind of investments that you look at. So it is really hard, and balancing, there's quite a few different aspects of our role which do make that quite tricky. But for me, for instance, on a Friday, I mean, it's things as basic as that, where I kind of put in a standard 2 hours a week where I can do some reading. I'll have a couple of theses that I'm working on at any one time, and to build up knowledge within that sector. That will be having seen secular trends within the market, building up an initial thesis, and then trying to prove or disprove that by either kind of reading things within a set amount of time, because anything less than 2 hours, you just don't really have the chance to get into it. Mm-hmm. That would be speaking to potential experts in the market, either through our network or continuing to build that if that's a new thesis area for us. So, the tech bio thesis is a good example of that, where we're pushing on a bit of a grey line of where we might want to invest, and still evaluating where that line is for us, because the technology angle is very strong, but the business model is a little bit more challenging, particularly with some of those businesses that we've looked at. So, how are we developing networks in those space to learn more, to make sure that when we're kind of building theses in that area, we are trying to learn from the very best and then trying to come up with our own slant on top. But to do that, you need to have a certain amount of time to think about it and step back and work out what your key questions are. So that's personally how I do it. I'm sure Simon has a completely different answer.
Well, I guess I was just going to underscore the benefits of having dedicated research in our team. I mean, I can think I am really on top of trends in enterprise security, for example. But Advika, our head of research, she can go and do 40 interviews of chief information security officers and CEOs of companies that are building in that space, distill those learnings, have another 40 calls where she's playing those learnings back to those people, and they're like, oh, wow, this is really interesting. MMC's got a great perspective on this. And then they might, share some more even. And I think no investor can do that. How do you carve out time to have 50 calls? It's very difficult.
Yeah.
And so I learn a lot, not just by reading her reports, and we share our research reports, which everyone in the team participates in. We publish them; they're available for everybody to read. But also, we're constantly having conversations in our office about what we're learning, what things surprised us, how we might reflect that in our investment thesis or piece of diligence we're doing on a company. And I feel like that's an unfair advantage. It's kind of an unfair advantage for me as someone trying to learn stuff. But it's an unfair advantage for us that we've worked hard to create and invest in as a firm.
And do you ever find yourselves, because one of the things I definitely suffer from is when I get excited about a technology, I can almost let that distract from the viability of a business model, right? Because there is a fascination and a beauty in a specific technology or a specific way of solving a problem. And I wonder, I'd love to know, especially when you have a research team which is a non-commercial part of a commercial entity, right? Like they are bringing you the raw material, or to some extent the raw material, which you then have to interrogate from a financial perspective. How do you guys does the research team take a commercial stance on stuff, or how do you plug that into the process? And if so, when?
Yeah.
So I was going to say, we're a company full of people that are distracted by shiny things and new tech. Right? So that's a real
as we should be. As we
all are.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Part of our job. Sorry, Charlotte, you were going to say something.
No. I like the comment. Yeah, we do like shiny things. I suppose. Yeah, the kind of constant communication is a key part of making sure we're both plugged in with the more technical side, which I think is where the research team and Advika, which he really brings. And then, we are probably the more commercial mindset where we kind of bring that to the technology she's looking at. But I think going back to, why we have a research team, we want to understand better the emerging technologies. And that doesn't mean we're going to invest in all of them. There have been projects in the past where we've looked at kind of technologies and thought, this is really interesting, but actually the time's not now, or we don't think now is the time to act. So we potentially have a thesis and that doesn't prove out. And that's okay. Because that might be, this is never going to happen. That might be just a market timing point. And then that's the kind of conversation that we will have and continue to have as time goes on. So I guess that's kind of, that's the point I would make, that's how we kind of mesh the two.
Related to the research part, I think one of the, if I'm not mistaken, one of the things that you guys have is a data-driven approach to top of the funnel and sourcing deals, especially if you invest also outside of the UK. So tell us a bit, I mean, as much as you can tell, but tell us a bit about how this works. This is something that we've tested out sometimes ourselves. I don't think we've ever cracked it yet. We're still working on it, but I'm curious how you guys approach this.
So I would say we have three fundamental kind of motions of how we find companies and have them find us. The first is kind of the most obvious and traditional, and everyone does it, which is we've been in the market a long time. We have a reasonably well-known brand. We try to be everywhere. We're furiously networking and hustling all the time, and people find us and you find people that way. And that kind of is table stakes. Every VC can do that. The second motion is we're very data-driven, particularly on the top of our funnel. So how we discover new companies and how we look for signals that we should get excited about them or pay a bit more attention to them. And we've built a stack of both in-house software that we've built here at MMC and also third-party tools and data sources that we plug into that, which works quite nicely together.
Because you have software developers as part of the team as well, Simon?
We don't have any dedicated software developers, but we have people in our team who are capable of building software. And so we're very fortunate as a team of tech specialists to have some people who sling good code. And we've had a few useful interns who have supplemented that along the way. For example, we've built a kind of data gathering and triage system that we call Alita. And what Alita does is monitor lots of data sources, both structured data from databases that we license or we can get API access to, and then also lots of unstructured data from newsletters and emails through to kind of lists that we find and we pump into the top of the funnel and so on. And it runs through a process where it tries to understand and disambiguate company names, which can be challenging, right? Apple the company versus Apple the fruit.
Yeah.
To match those against multiple different databases, gather a bunch of different attributes about that company, and then run a relatively simple triage process against criteria that we've set, things like stage and funding and so on. And we're using Google's TensorFlow system to do that, so it's a machine learning based approach. So it's not kind of perfectly looking for hard edges and Boolean search. It's making probability-based judgments. We also, when we've identified that a company fits our criteria, we pull in some other data from different data sets. We pull it into our CRM, and then it creates effectively a piece of like a mini report and an alert for someone in the team to take a look at that company. And we're also, by gathering that data, looking to understand things like trajectory, how fast are the number of employees growing and so on. That's something that we've iterated over time. I think there's no perfect system that some VC can just build. I think a lot of VCs talk about how they've sunk all these hundreds of thousands and millions into building such and such system. The reality is you need a variety of approaches, a variety of tools, and those tools need to land in a system that you can actually run with as a team and collaborate with, which for us is our deal flow pipeline. We also supplement that with some tools that we license that do things like identify the movement of people between companies, identify when new companies are founded and so on. I think as you come down our funnel to, the nitty gritty of we're building relationships, we're getting really deep into companies, we continue to use data tools, but it's much more a human endeavor. And I think, at least for now, a judgment-based approach and a relationship-building-based approach is completely essential to VC, not just understanding and diligencing a company, but putting yourself in a position to really build conviction and then have the relationship to be able to lead a deal. And then the third motion that we have is our research approach, where we'll be proactively deciding to look at a market, look at a technology trend. Could be something quite niche, like the application of data science in some niche area of fintech infrastructure or insurance underwriting or something, or it could be a bit broader than that. And then we'll get from there to a market map where we'll look at potentially thousands of companies, distill them down to probably hundreds, and then between the research team and the investment team go and speak to dozens of these businesses and try to figure out who's interesting. And we don't really care where those companies are. They could be in London, Paris, or Berlin, or they could be in the edges of northern, southern, or eastern Europe. And we're able to identify them through a variety of techniques, and that guides how we investigate those companies and make investment decisions. So we just, our last deal was in Estonia, for example. The founder lives in Greece. We don't care. We're happy to meet a company wherever they are in Europe. And by publishing that information, we also drive that loop of people will see that we're interested in areas A, B, and C, and they'll make introductions, they'll refer, they'll come and say, hey, you missed us off your market map. And we'll say, brilliant, come tell us about your company. So that works quite nicely too.
The only thing I'd add to that, I think it works just on the research piece. If we've mapped a company and from the relationship or the AI approach, we've, for whatever reason, haven't got a response to them, that tends to be a really good tool for us to really unlock those conversations, to kind of, get in front of that founder and start build a relationship, sort of sending them something rather than just saying, hi, come speak to us, we're MMC, actually putting our report in front of them. And we do this quite a lot and say, hey, you're in our map, like, look at what we think of kind of the market, and we've spoken to these number of customers. That tends to get a lot more attention than just a kind of cold outreach.
It's one of the things I always find startling is the kind of difference it makes just being 5 or 10% above the baseline of level of interest in something, that like to demonstrate to other investors, to founders, to whoever, being like, look, we actually spent a month or 2 months of our time thinking about this quite seriously. We think what you're doing is really cool. The difference in response versus like, hi, I'm Charlotte from MMC. Would you like to have a chat? So just like insert VC template here is always quite surprising.
And sometimes we've spoken to buyers and we think buyers care about this. And we think you're doing okay on this one, but we think they care about this other one. And we're not sure you're doing so great. So here's what we learned. And that's a challenge, not just we're really enthusiastic, which works quite nicely.
Big time. Well, maybe changing pace a little bit then. One of the things that I think these conversations when we're speaking to the Project A guys, the Creandum guys, and you touched on it with VC being a very young industry, especially in Europe, right? Like most funds, as you say, 80% of the industry, probably more or less, have not been in this job for more than half a decade. And I would argue the same is probably the case with funds, right? Like maybe a little bit longer, but 8 to 10 years is definitely puts you over halfway in terms of age. How do you guys think about coming into your 25th year about culture and about building a firm versus a fund? Because I think for me, it feels like it's not easy to raise money, but it's relatively straightforward, especially if you have a track record as an entrepreneur or in financial services, to raise a pool of money, go and deploy that money, and then people kind of realize that, oh Christ, I've got to do this again and again and again, and it's a job that only really makes sense to do for either a very short amount of time to use as a launch pad into another industry, or for kind of a 10-year plus vision. So I'd love to know how you guys, especially Simon, having been around for a while now, like how you think about building a firm and what that differs from a series of funds and kind of just a pot of money.
Yeah, I mean, it's a critical question. I think the first thing to say is we are building a firm, and as individuals, the opportunity to build our own business and evolve our thinking, and to bring new people into our culture and have them impact and influence and evolve our thinking all the time is part of what makes this interesting and what makes this fun. And I think if you were at a firm that's very static, I think you'd move on after a while because it's not interesting and it's not keeping pace. You said when we were talking about this before, Max, funds are strange places. And I think you're right. I think all funds are strange places, and the most strange ones are probably the most interesting. So our particular flavor of strange place, I'd say, really started with the founders, and they were building a firm, having come from the city of London, where culture is very uptight and cutthroat, and you negotiate to within an inch of your life on every deal. They wanted to build something that was different to that, and I think that was somewhat true even in venture capital back then. Founder friendly was not really a phrase that was as popular 25 years ago as it is today. And Bruce and Alan, who founded MMC, wanted to create a culture both internally and with the entrepreneurs that they were working with that was collegiate and supportive, and a group of people that you'd want to spend time with. And that was kind of a new and surprising concept in venture capital at the time. And that really is carried forward to today. And every person that we bring into the firm, we want to evolve our culture, but also we want them to be somebody that's going to, be a kind of warm and positive addition. And we think very carefully about bringing people in. So, we've constructed a team quite deliberately with a set of specialisms around technology, around industry domains. But I would say everybody, first of all, is really excited by the applications of technologies in ways that change the world. Second of all, they're excited to support and collaborate with their colleagues on deals. And, we don't have a kind of star culture where, we've got some star partner who's going and doing all the deals and the associates kind of come behind and do the DD. We're quite a bottoms up team where everybody can bring ideas, theses, and find companies and bring them through. And then, junior and senior people in our team will jump on the deal and support that person as we progress it. And that kind of bottom-up motion is part of our culture as well. And then finally, I would say we're an intergenerational or multi-generational team. We have the founders who started the business 25 years ago who are still involved. We have younger partners who are just coming through today. And then we've got a next generation of associates and principals and others who are, contributing and starting to lead parts of our firm, parts of our thesis. Charlotte's a great example of that. And that multi-generational team kind of working well, and everybody having an opportunity without glass ceilings and without, kind of very rigid structures, I think creates the opportunity for people to build a long-term career here. And having an opportunity to build a long-term career at a VC is what keeps people, excited to do that building of the firm that I was talking about, I think. Charlotte, you've joined, quite a while ago now, a bit more recently. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I can give a view. I guess particularly coming from another fund as well. And, this isn't the sort of career where you move around. Like it doesn't make sense to move around a lot. So, I thought about that decision quite carefully when I moved. And I think some of the things I liked about the culture at MMC, and picking up some of the threads that Simon talked about. So the first one, I think the collegiate style of the team. And if you think about venture, everybody talks about track record, right? So track record of the firm, but also track record of the individual. And I think, that can promote some certain behaviours, which I don't think we have. And I do think the team is very supportive if someone wants to win a new investment and, throw kind of, all the resources that we can potentially offer to that entrepreneur to help that individual secure that investment. So that was something that I really looked for, I think. And I think that's something we have in Bucket. So that's really important to me. And I think, just even at a personal level, right, all funds really are quite small. I mean, there's obviously a couple of really large ones, but they tend to be small groups of people. So there's, having the diversity from an academic perspective to bring new ideas and those ideas be accepted and have autonomy to bring those forward and develop them was very important. That's something I've really enjoyed doing here. But I also think then just, people coming from different kind of backgrounds, to different people's point of view, and everybody having a voice in kind of the conversations and our meetings where we're kind of exchanging views. So I think that's a big part of it. So I think the personal side, in terms of the people you've been working in with day out, is very important from a culture perspective, and making sure you're all aligned on the values and what you're all trying to achieve. But at the same time, being open to the flexibility that this market moves really quickly and you've got to adapt quickly. And I think that's something we're doing every week. So, yeah, so that's probably my point of view on that.
On this topic, how are you guys organized? And how is how does the firm work? I mean, we always like to ask these questions because the way we operate, at least at K-Fund, it's always changing. It probably changes every year. I mean, there's some things that are core to the way we operate, but some aspects about how we make investment decisions, how the team is organized, always changes. So what's the current iteration of MMC, and how do you guys work?
Yeah, I mean, let's not get too in-depth because I don't know how it's a bit inside baseball. But I would say we focus very hard on playing venture capital in multiplayer. And I think a lot of funds play venture capital in single player in parallel. They have these people doing that and these other people chasing those deals, and there's not a lot of collaboration. When I bring a new junior investor into our team, I tell them, look, it's not your job this year to find a deal that we're going to do. It's your job to be a part of the team as a whole, having great coverage of the market, doing great research and coming up with points of view that we decide are part of our investment thesis, and to fulfill all our responsibilities across the portfolio. It's not your job to find that one deal this year. And I really want to impress on people that if the machine works really well, and we are building a team that cohesively together can see 5,000 companies a year and meet many hundreds of companies a year, and then really focus our resources and our time on the small number of entrepreneurs that we believe have got the potential to be really incredible, then we're going to be successful. And I think that's quite difficult to create deliberately. You need great tools. You need technology is a big part of that. But I would say it's cultural, and it's how people are seen to succeed, and how you incentivize people as well. I mean, in terms of structure, we have an investment team that includes full-time research people and members of our investment teams that are doing research for part of their time. And it also includes a platform and community team that are working very closely with us both before we invest in a company and afterwards. Other than that, I mean, we're organised in a fairly kind of simple and traditional way that's not too hierarchical. Different people in the team are focused on different investment domains in a soft rather than a hard way, so people can cross those boundaries very easily. People tend to specialize a bit more as they become more experienced. I think that's more about creating a track record and specialist knowledge and relevance for founders than it is about, we force people down a particular track. And that specialism can be in any axis. So, I've been in VC now for about 12 years, and I've kind of resisted specializing in a vertical for that whole time. But I've become fairly specialist in backing, companies building in-house data science teams, applying AI in big markets, and then building the infrastructure layer underneath that. And also in the way that those companies build their go-to-market and think about expansion and internationalization and so on. So that's an axis of specialization without saying, hey, I'm Simon, I'm the fintech guy or the health guy or whatever. And that's okay. And different people do different things.
And I think that really nicely actually segues into talking about thesis. And Charlotte, you touched on it earlier with fintech and some stuff happening in tech bio, right? The research function is obviously a fascinating way to think about this, because you can preordain theses, or at least kind of a universe of theses that you can then select between. The flip side of that is this is an incredibly hype-driven industry, right? Where we have these insane trend cycles that last anywhere between 6 weeks and a couple of years, sometimes lead to fundamental changes in how industries operate, sometimes lead to absolutely nothing and a lot of people burning a lot of cash on a lot of things that look like JPEGs. I would love to understand how you guys think about the pipeline of, like, so I don't know, I was reading your stuff on responsible AI and the investment you just did in the vector space, right? Like, some of this stuff is so far, like, so near to the coalface of where technology is coming. How are you looking at what's out from that, and then how are you subsequently working out what actually makes a viable thesis within that versus just something that's really interesting to look at?
Yeah, so I can take that, because I think there's a number of ways you could probably answer that. So if I take maybe an example of like the tech bio thesis, right, and how we kind of evaluated that and the timing for that, because I think that falls into what you said, that I think that is quite a hyped space right now, like certainly elements within that. And what we've seen there is, there were kind of early companies in that space with the whole, when AI came to the fore and people were just using the technology, throwing it at kind of, data sets that pharma had to see what kind of potential new drugs or new interesting data around the kind of science came out at the end of that. And I think on large, that wasn't necessarily a successful strategy. And there's still a lot of those businesses that have yet to find any positive signals in that strategy. So, for the research of that, one of the key parts of the research was actually understanding what's happened before, that actually AI has been around for some time. AI was being applied to this industry. It was probably a little bit early, and the data maturity that those businesses had was just not there for that to be a successful strategy. So then the question is then, well, why now? It has that changed now? And that was kind of one of the leading questions I had when starting to look at this. And then if so, what are the type of businesses? What are the type of business models? Right. So it's actually, yes, the technology is important. Yes, the data is important. But we kind of know a little bit about that now. So what's changed in the market today that means that's likely to be successful now as opposed to 5 years ago? So that, I guess that was kind of one of then, for the research we did last year, that was the key question, talking to pharma companies, talking to people building in that area to work out what was the case there. And I think talking specifically about that, one of the things we found was what tends to changing is the attitude of pharma to use these technologies is changing. They don't have necessarily the internal talent in terms of in-house data science teams, because frankly, those people want to work elsewhere. A lot of them want to go build their own thing. So they are having to partner, and you're looking at an industry that's used to partnering, right, for services or for drug discovery or acquiring a lot of their innovation into their own internal pipelines and developing them at the later stages. So the attitudes have continued to change and mature throughout times. I think going back to what you said earlier is, does the commercial line up with the technology? I think the answer to that was a resounding yes. And then I guess further to that, the bit of technology which I think did need to improve was, compute power has continued to improve over time. That's going on an upward trajectory still. Then the amount of data which is informing kind of decisions is continuing to go up. Therefore, needs that higher commute. So there was a lot of then macro trends. I won't go too much into the detail, but there are a lot of kind of trends that would point to actually the time is now. So then that's like, great. Once we've now understood that, then what are the businesses in that area that we think are kind of an MMC investment where we can add value to those businesses, opposed to the ones which are going too far down the route of being a therapeutic, which is a completely different proposition. And you've got different portfolio kind of construction, and there's a lot of other things to think about there, and not least from a network perspective as well. So, and that's something, we're still kind of working out, but we developed a thesis in that, which we're continuing to test, continuing to iterate, and learning a lot in the process. And yeah.
And then, we are by no means the same level of experts as you are on this, but we've been looking a little bit recently into the kind of like enzyme, protein, molecule folding discovery space, right? When you're doing like the end-to-end kind of machine learning into wet lab, into kind of realized. And one of the things we've really struggled with in that space is differentiation in the sense of when the machine learning algorithms are to a large extent a black box. And like when we're doing customer references on this, you're speaking to senior tech guys at like fortune pharma companies going, we don't know exactly how this works. Like we have a lot of money and we'll work with a variety of players, but we kind of have to judge it on its results and on kind of like midterm viability. And then I was also looking at your portfolio and a business, and Synthesia stood out because obviously it's been a very high profile business recently. And I'm sure you guys have seen the same, but we've seen dozens of businesses trying to do similar stuff in that space, like copycats or different verticals or whatever. I'd love to know, maybe with an example like Synthesia, how you try and find the signals from the noise there in a space that, because you talk about market readiness and I completely agree, but then you can often find you hit this inflection point where suddenly everyone's doing it, right? Mm-hmm. And you get this weird thing where someone in the US, someone in Belgium and someone in, I don't know, Singapore will have the same idea at the same time in 3 different parts of the world and have businesses that look very similar. And then it can often be quite hard to find the signals from the noise. So, yeah, how do you try and, when you get to that, okay, the market feels ready, there's been this kind of Cambrian explosion of activity, what do we do now? Like, how do you guys think about that?
I think one of the things is to spot the technology change before that Cambrian explosion, but maybe not, to Charlotte's point about market readiness, maybe not actually place any bets just for a little while. So generative AI, which we could talk about forever, of course, maybe we'll get there. But that's the technology that Synthesia is based on, is something that now everyone's paying a lot of attention to. There's a lot of hype in the market. We published a report in 2019 that talked about generative AI as an approach that was coming, that was interesting, that we were paying attention to. And actually that same year, we invested in the seed round of Synthesia. So that was our first, I guess it was our first generative AI investment, although not our first investment in an AI company doing generation of text and generation of images and generation of things. We'd backed companies before that were doing that. Synthesia was a great example of the market was just ready enough that the technology was interesting and that there were early applications, but not so developed that there was a mature product set. And actually, when we first backed Synthesia, it really was a seed bet. There wasn't really a product. There was a technology that they could sort of manually create videos out of. Synthesia is a product to generate AI avatars that can speak and move and gesticulate in a photorealistic way. And they had the technology ready in a kind of demo and pilot form, but there wasn't the kind of creation studio product that they have today.
What year was this, Simon, that you first invested in the company?
This was 2019. So we found them in 2018. We invested in 2019. I think we were the first investor to make a commitment to invest in Synthesia, and then we helped them to pull a round together. We've now invested in the business 4 times over 4 funding rounds. So that's a great example of, we've got to spot the technology early and then be alert to it. Then we've got to look for companies that are at the early stages of that technology development, but look like they might have a product, even if they don't quite have it yet. So that business was a great collaboration between a couple of university professors, academics, and some kind of young, very capable entrepreneurs who were together in the founding team. And our thesis was that as that technology developed and its applications emerged, that would be a team that could figure that out over time. And that's kind of back to the core of what we look for. We're looking for a team that can take an early technology but really commercialize it and make it real. And in the case of businesses like Synthesia, you need that leading edge, sometimes academic knowledge and expertise in the space, but you really need the entrepreneurial and commercial focus to be able to bring that to fruition in some kind of product that's got fit in the market.
Yeah, and I guess on that, I think, the technology bit is, as you say, a core part of our thesis. But, in terms of I think about this a lot, in terms of your point, Max, where you're saying that actually you can miss the mark and then suddenly you've missed kind of the opportunity because things are moving so quickly. And, something we say that, if Synthesia was a few years later to market, we're seeing a lot of kind of copycat businesses now, but, that is now the kind of category leader for that type of business. So the timing has been really important that. But, an idea is an idea, but without kind of the team. And I think what's really impressed us about this team was the speed of which they've iterated on the product. So not just the technology, but how they've created that into a product and evolved that over time in rapid pace, just really responsive to kind of the customer feedback, which has allowed them to move at the pace that they have. Because, others could have, with equal technology, could have come in and, kind of beaten them to the post. But I think that was the other bit which sort of says, look, the technology is important, but there was obviously, the team, the execution. And I think that was, they're probably one of the leading teams in the market for doing that as well. So I just want to emphasize that point.
Nice. Congrats on the deal. On the opposite side of things, are there any technologies or trends that you guys have spent a lot of time on, be it yourselves or the research team, where you think that the market is not yet ready, but you're still keeping an eye on? Can you talk about any of those? Are there any?
Yeah, we can talk about it. So I think, this isn't a project that I led myself, so I can't go into too much detail on it, but we spent quite a bit of time looking at the quantum market. And actually, we did that a couple of years ago. We are continuing to look at it. Actually, one of our new associates is very interested in that market, so is now refreshing our views on that. And I think that's a good example of what happens over a lot of different projects that we look at. And at the time, which was a few years ago, I think we felt technology super interesting, obviously a very broad set of applications, not least drug discovery and a bunch of others. But we didn't make an investment at the time because from market mapping, we didn't necessarily think that was ready for the kind of commercial inflection point that we were looking for at that point in time. So, I think that's a kind of it's not an if, it's just a when. So with things like that, we'll continue to look at it as we are right now, continue to meet businesses in the space, and then continue to keep on top of where we think that market is, I suppose. That's probably one example I'd pick out. I don't know, Simon.
We're quite happy to then share what we've learned, right? So we published 2 pieces on the quantum space in 2020 and 2021. And we laid out how we were thinking about it, how we were structuring it, where we thought venture capital could play, where venture capital was less relevant. Ultimately, we didn't make an investment, but that was a piece that drove great conversations in the market. It meant that we made sense for entrepreneurs building in that space to come and talk to us, and we remain open to that conversation. And that's the kind of thing that we're happy to do. We sometimes, like research in other spaces, research doesn't lead to anything immediately, but we're still happy to kind of share and have conversations around it.
Yeah.
And so one that I think relates to this is Simon, we were talking before about Modo Energy, right? Trying to become a kind of super app for energy data around storage. And for me, that's a space I've spent a decent amount of time looking at recently and still struggle with market readiness on, right? A lot of stuff in energy storage, energy management, in terms of where the technology, it's an easy one to get really, really excited about the technology because there's a kind of simple beauty to it or a complex beauty to it. But the business models are really difficult, especially if you're selling into utilities or you're selling into large enterprises that might not have the infrastructure set up yet or might not really get it quite yet. Could you talk us a little bit through that investment and what got you excited about Modo Energy?
Yeah, very happy to. And I've just gotten back from Austin, Texas, where the founder has moved himself, his wife, his baby, and his dog out to start the company there. quite funny actually. The company started in Birmingham before expanding into London and now Austin. And so there's 5 Brummie lads have gone out from the UK to Austin, and they're busy teaching all the
Fantastic.
all the Birmingham slang. So yeah, it was quite amusing being in their office. So Modo is a company in the energy storage space. So think big lithium batteries on the electricity grid, managing volatility when, you know, the sun might be shining sometime and not other times, it's windy or not windy, power plants go up and down, and batteries fulfill a couple of really important functions on the grid, both kind of smoothing that, second by second or minute by minute volatility, and then also managing the kind of daily and kind of weather-based sort of medium-term, short to medium-term volatility on the energy grid. And that's a great example, I suppose, of it's a climate tech investment in a way, and that's a space that we've made now a lot of investments in. We like businesses that are creating energy efficiencies, that are enabling the infrastructure transition that we're making in the energy market, and that are circular businesses enabling the reuse of materials and products. But it's very much a software and data company. And we're kind of excited but cautious on climate tech as a whole. We think a lot of money's been raised into climate tech and green tech funds that is being put into businesses that really are more infrastructure investments, or they're capex heavy, or they won't necessarily scale like VC type investments. And they should be funded, but maybe they shouldn't be funded in a kind of traditional venture model. And what we look for is companies that have all the characteristics of a software company and the ability to grow fast in a capital light kind of a way. So it's kind of natural for us to look at businesses that are in the analytics and data space, really in any market. And, you know, I personally have led lots of investments in the last decade that are fundamentally data analytics businesses. So what Modo does is gather all the data about batteries across the grid, starting in the UK, and now they're in other markets as well. That's physical data, which batteries are charging and discharging, and what's their health, what are they doing, what's the weather and the characteristics in their geographic location. And it's also the sort of financial and trading data. So who's making what kind of revenue, who's bidding for which government-run auctions in the different kinds of electricity market auctions that are out there, and so on. And they build a picture of both at an asset level and at an industry and grid level what's going on. And that information is useful to all the market participants in that space, from battery owners and their operating partners through to the financial sector, you know, people who are underwriting the build out and lending against the build out of new batteries, providing insurance and audit and so on. And our thesis really there is that you need a kind of Bloomberg of that market where you can build forecasts and do modeling that really represent that part of the grid in a very accurate way, and that can be used both to make short-term, daily and minute-by-minute decisions, and also can be used to do, 15 or 30-year forecasts that underwrite the growth of that market. And so, in a way, if our investment is successful and Modo is successful, then that's going to support the build-out of that battery storage market as a whole, and mean that more market participants can feel confident investing in that space. That's likely to promote the faster growth of that part of the infrastructure that fundamentally we're all going to need if we're going to create enough renewable capacity and evolve the electricity grid and so on. I mean, the volatility piece is kind of interesting because, you said you've been thinking about the macro trends in that market. So even right now, the GB market in Great Britain, I mean, the island of Great Britain, not the whole of the UK, because that's how the electricity market's organised, is almost an all-time low. And the share prices of all the battery storage operators have completely tanked in the last few months. Whereas in Texas, where I've just come back from, the market is absolutely booming. Everybody's investing. New facilities are being built out and so on. And so, it's kind of interesting. It's a data company that's engaged in the business of understanding volatility in a particular asset class. And also it's a volatile and relatively immature market that's different place to place. And part of our investment thesis has to be to understand the short-term volatility. What's the best way to fund businesses through what's going to be a immature market for a while, and what's the role that a company like Modo can play, but also the long-term trends, which are kind of irrefutable in that space. Batteries are being built out. They fulfill really important functions, and we're super bullish on the long-term need for more and more battery infrastructure.
Well, that's one of the things, I think, going back to Charlotte's point about market timing, that I both love and find frustrating about a lot of stuff, especially in climate software, right? The tailwinds are so obvious and so fundamental that you can't disagree that something like this will be needed at some point in the next 1, 5, 15, 10, 15 years. But it's trying to hang your hat on exactly why now is the moment. And just one follow-up question on that then, out of interest. Who are they selling to? Who are their customers? Because one of the things we've passed on a lot of deals that are dependent on utilities, because utilities are just very, very hard to play with, right? They'll trial you for a long time, to kind of sell you all these narratives around how there'll be these big contracts down the line, and then you realize they're a very high volume, very low margin play who doesn't really want to sacrifice any of that unless they really have to. So you have to find these quite novel ways of selling to enterprise, selling to B2B, selling to like the transmission and distribution operators as opposed to the utilities. Like, how have they managed to work around the largest player in these markets often being one of the most unpleasant to play with?
I mean, the interesting thing about investing in an early market is that the TAM, the total addressable market, is quite small. It's big enough, but it's not enormous. And so you sort of need to sell to everybody, and you need to plan to expand in many different axes. You need to expand geographically, you need to expand into different customer segments, and you need to provide new and different products over time to grow your TAM. And so Modo sells to everybody, the people that own and operate batteries, the people that underwrite and lend against battery infrastructure, the people who are in adjacent parts of the market, maybe offering or building renewable plants and facilities, or even people who are operating gas peaker plants that come on and off at the peaks of the market need to understand what batteries are doing, because their revenue is probably going to be dependent on the charging and discharging patterns of batteries that are sitting somewhere down the grid. And then as the market financializes, which hasn't really happened in batteries yet, you'll get what we've seen in every other energy sector segment, which is hedge funds will want to play, and there'll be trader kind of mechanics and traded funds and that sort of stuff. And there's lots of fun to be had in the next few years as that market matures. And then I guess the other thing is you need to provide a service that, even people that don't really have a need for parts of your product, they're still going to want to have a relationship with you and be a market participant that will play with your brand. So in Modo's case, they did something really clever, which is they built an energy storage leaderboard and a kind of benchmark service where they're ranking and scoring every battery site and every battery operator and owner on the grid. And in that market now, people get really excited. They're like, oh, you made more revenue than me this quarter. What are we doing wrong? Or we're top of the leaderboard. We're really excited, and let's shout about it. And the other thing they did is they built this fantastic set of effectively training materials and information about that market. And again, it's a nascent market. There are new professionals coming into it all the time who need to understand some of the basics and get up to speed. And so they've created something called the Energy Academy. And we've heard stories in our reference calls of customers saying, basically when a new person joins and they're not from the battery market, we say, go hang out with Modo and their YouTube channel for a couple of weeks and then come back and you'll be a bit more useful. And that's brilliant for creating a service that everyone in the industry knows and starts to rely on. I think if you were selling into the oil market, it's super deep, super mature. You could do something super niche, do it really, really well, make a lot of money in a big space. And that's kind of completely the opposite of market readiness.
It's interesting. It's I'll pass over to Jaime for the next question, but it's interesting that kind of where you have these very nascent, often climate markets. I was speaking to one of the investors in HeatGeek, their heat pump installation business in the UK, who similarly have built a sense of community off basically a YouTube channel of for installers that allows them to kind of hack their way into a much larger segment of the serviceable addressable market in the short term, so they can kind of overcome the problems about playing in a smaller market to begin with by occupying or at least having greater share of mind in that space, with the then intention to grow with that market as it develops. And I think there's a really interesting in the kind of evangelism side of climate, which is, I think you see some of it similarly in the artificial intelligence space, right, where you have like small groups of real experts who are true evangelists of stuff that then build community around what they're doing as a way to kind of like hack the market bigger as if it might not quite be ready yet. But Jaime, next question from you.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, you mentioned before when you were talking about two core areas of interest, you mentioned data-driven health. What are you looking into? And I also think you have like a success story to share about current health. But so what's interesting in the data-driven health space right now?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk about a couple of things that we've been looking at. So, I guess there's kind of what we've tried to look at within health is where is the intersection of bits of health kind of with these like technologies that we kind of know well. So the current health story, for instance, that was AI. That came out of our AI report that we did a couple of years ago, or more than that now, and identified the technology was really interesting, but the application in healthcare was particularly interesting, particularly with the rise of remote patient monitoring. So Current Health was one of the first businesses to build in that space. So a couple of founders based out of Edinburgh. We invested at the seed. They had a really interesting way that they built their product. And they were largely in the NHS when we invested, and they continued building in the NHS until the A. And this is kind of typical of what we see actually with a lot of kind of European businesses selling into healthcare systems. They built a product using data within the NHS, which actually compared to the US system, which is ultimately the bigger market where a lot of them are focusing their attention, you've got very good longitudinal data of over 30 years, which is quite rare. Given that in the US, people move around because they're linked to different employer kind of health insurers systems. Every 7 years, people tend to move, so you don't have that kind of breadth of data. So they built a product from hardware, better sort of sensors to kind of capture the data, and then embedded that within the kind of electronic healthcare record to intervene with patients at home, and really one of the first companies in this sort of virtual care, which, is still a big trend today that we're seeing both in Europe and the US. And then we invested at the Series A. So we led the Series A after participating in the seed to then really take on the US market. And at which point the founder, Chris, moved out to the US and really started, the hard graft of kind of localizing the product and selling to kind of healthcare systems. And I think, again, going back to the team, the execution that we saw there was very impressive. Chris is very relentless in, he really believed in the product, really believed in the market opportunity. But, the sales cycles are long to these big healthcare systems. They had a little bit of, don't want to use the word luck on the side, but COVID was obviously around the time where they were really scaling, and they were scaling quite nicely anyway. But obviously that was something that really drove the trend of healthcare at home forward. So they saw a lot more inbound in terms of kind of customers who are looking to build out their solutions there. And as part of that, I think one of the things that they realized, which was quite interesting, is, the tech, and this is actually quite common within a lot of healthcare, and this is a trend that we're looking into at the moment, is that the tech is one piece of the solution, but there's obviously a lot of kind of infrastructure and clinical infrastructure that needs to come with this. And if you look at, 10% of GDP is healthcare spend. It's a massive, massive market, but the majority of that today is actually services. And technology is eating into that to a certain extent, but to operationalize the tech, that's a really important part of the platform. So back in 22, Current Health partnered up with Best Buy. So that was, we exited from the business at that point. That was the right point for the business. So very good exit, but very good for the founders to kind of take the business forward, partnered up with Best Buy, who had the operational infrastructure, and Current Health had the sort of market leading tech in that space. So bringing the two together, and Chris until recently has been leading the head of sort of tech within kind of Best Buy. So that was a really interesting story, which I think showed, the rise of technology, the application of technology within healthcare, that kind of journey of internationalizing the business over to the US, which we see a lot of healthcare businesses look to do, and raising a good amount of money to be able to do that. And then, work out the go-to-market there, which is it's definitely hard, but took the business to move there. All the founders moved there, or the majority of them moved there, and really kind of build up that story there, and ultimately achieved a very good result for both the sort of team and investors. So yeah, that was, I guess, the current health story. And then reflecting on that and thinking about where we're looking, what we're looking at today. So part at the beginning of this year, that was something I was thinking very closely about. Where are we looking to invest, particularly now that there is renewed hype around kind of AI, generative AI. Where are the potential intersections within the healthcare services that could be interesting? And I think one of the trends that we're tracking, and we're still developing our thesis, to be honest, is around AI with back office automation. There's been a lot of hype in this space at the moment, from ambient listening of patient, and kind of pre-recording patient notes and building those into using that data, that unstructured data, and using the application of large language models on top. So that's one area that we've seen pick up a lot of traction. And then also billing. So medical coding is another area, which is a different area of the back office AI sort of technologies, I guess, within healthcare. So that's kind of another area. So we're still looking at that. What's the best wedge product to build out a broader platform? Because I think all of these are interesting products in their own right, but ultimately to build a really big business, it needs to be a bit broader than that. But, what we've seen is a lot of these businesses going into medical coding or pre-authorization are growing very, very quickly. And the opportunity for those businesses, there really is largely in the US. So that's something we've been thinking about a lot. And then the second one is going back to what I said around current health and needing to operationalize the tech, from an industry that is used to buying services. Where do we want to play within that area of, say, specialty care, which is outsourced from a healthcare system, which is definitely the direction of travel. And there's typically a sort of platform with with a technology offering. So again, that's probably another area we'll spend a bit more time doing a bit more work into. And one of the areas we've seen pick up within that is things such as sort of things that are typically offered as private care. So, within fertility, for instance, we're seeing a lot of kind of growth there, where there's various models that are taking off using technology to improve better patient care, either clinically or operationally. So that's kind of a bit of a flavour, I guess, of some of the areas we've been looking at.
And that, data-driven health extends into the use of health data to create new kinds of health interventions in the future. And so that thesis extends into the life sciences and pharmaceutical space. So, with the rise of the opportunity for more personalized and precision medicines and the ability to do clinical trials with smaller groups of highly selected patients that are a particular fit for that piece of research, that also brings data challenges. And some of the investments that we've made in the last few years are trying to help out in that space, so enable better clinical trial recruitment or different kinds of personalized medicine approaches. And Charlotte's led a couple of investments in that space. Sanogenetics is one that recently they just raised a follow-on round that we participated in. We invested a couple of years ago, bringing together lots of different biobank kind of data sets. So from hospital systems to charities to government stores of lots of people's DNA records and indeed often demographic and medical data that goes along with that. How do you do clinical trial recruitment across those biobanks without disrespecting or breaking the kind of privacy and data security needs and ultimately patient confidentiality? And they've created a solution there. So sort of healthcare system business. It's very much serving the pharmaceutical and life sciences sector, but it's all part of how do we use data to create better health interventions ultimately.
Got you. One of the things Charlotte touched on there was the necessity of the US as a go-to-market route, and so you guys are, I believe, your portfolio is 80-ish% over the last 20 years UK based, right? You've done a lot of investments in the UK and then a number and elsewhere in Europe as well. I'd love to know, especially, I suppose, with a lens on health, but also a lens on artificial intelligence, where, as you say, you guys were doing a lot of stuff kind of before it was cool, as it were, and building out quite like a very robust portfolio before the real hype years of the last maybe 24, 36 months. How are you feeling, and I hate to use the B word, but upon a post-Brexit Britain in terms of the ecosystem in London versus what you see on the continent, and then how you see that interacting with the US, and maybe whether that's changed in recent years or actually kind of whether the trajectory has remained more or less linear in how those ecosystems play with one another?
I can start and then maybe Simon can follow up with some additional thoughts. So, I mean, yeah, look, I think when Brexit happened, there was a worrying moment, right, where we thought, there were rumours that a lot of businesses would necessarily move, headquarters to more European-friendly jurisdictions. Sort of Ireland was, one of those. Berlin was touted to be one of those as well. And I think the pleasantly surprising thing for me that I've certainly seen is that hasn't actually happened, I would say. I think, there's been a couple of cases where that's happened, but on large, there's still a lot of businesses that are being created in the UK. And I think there's a couple of reasons that I think, for a bridge to the US, obviously that's an important piece here, I think, from simply, the language side of things, right? Like there's a lot of US investors that have set up here in London. And that's been in more recent years post-Brexit. So I think that's kind of one signal that we can definitely talk about. And then I think the other thing is just, the talent that we've got here is so good. So we've got some great universities, particularly in the more technical businesses that we back. So, from the universities, from, Oxford, Cambridge, I mean, I'm not going to name them all, but there's clearly a lot going on. And obviously they've got that in Europe as well. And you've got ETH, who's spinning out some really great kind of technical businesses in the AI space, and responsible AI. We're seeing a lot coming out of that. But I think UK, in terms of broader Europe, is in a strong position. And again, as I say, that bridge to the US. So, that's kind of my more general thoughts. I mean, one of the questions we more generally ask, and I think is specifically pertinent in health, is when we're looking at all these businesses, and particularly given when we do our research, right, in a particular area, whilst we're just investing in Europe, we have to look at what the US is doing from a market mapping perspective, right? And because that's going to be important if you're ultimately going after that global market. And a lot of them are going to the US at some point in their trajectory. And so within health, one of the questions, and AI actually, will be, what is the business that's built here in Europe? Like, what is the advantage they potentially have in a US market than potentially being just started and scaled within the US, right? So I talked a little bit about AI in medical coding. Like I would need to see some really clear signals. I think there's some really exciting businesses there, but that is largely a US market. I don't think there's a really big opportunity in Europe for that. So, but that's specific to kind of that thesis. But there's others as well. So I think that's a question that we talk about quite a lot as a team.
I would just add that, talent has been one of the areas where we were most worried, and I think others had a perception of negativity around in the context of Brexit. And I think what we've seen actually is more like an adjustment than a fall. So it's become a little bit more difficult to bring in amazing talent from the EU, but only marginally, really. And then it's become a little bit easier to bring in talent from, America, Canada, Australia, India, even parts of Europe that weren't in the EU. So, we have 3 or 4 of our companies that have Ukrainian development teams, for example. Slightly easier to recruit those people now, actually, although not obviously bring them physically here in the last couple of years. So I think some of the negatives have been balanced by, everyone's just adapted, really, and there's some talent advantages from kind of leveling of the playing field for global immigration as opposed to just from Europe.
And what's been amazing to watch is actually, like, in the past 2 or 3 years, all of the large US funds opening shop in London. I mean, they didn't choose any other market, but most of them are there now.
Yeah, I mean, London is as Charlotte was saying, sort of the bridge from Europe to the US. And I think we've always believed that was an important part of our job at MMC, was to identify the best companies born somewhere in Europe that were ultimately destined to become global leaders, global category leaders, and to help them bridge to the US. And London was the best place to do that. And that's still what we believe. So, Max, you said we were kind of 80% historically in the UK, but today we're probably more like 50 or 60% UK, 40 to 50% non-UK European businesses. Sometimes they're expanding into the UK and sometimes straight into the US. But either way, it's sort of sector by sector, depending on what makes sense for that model, right? We're backing a lot of infrastructure companies that are kind of natively global from day one. They're open source, or they're, a credit card sign up. It's probably a product-led growth motion. Probably 50% of the customer base is US, even at the pre-seed stage when they first launched their free product, through to maybe a healthcare business where you actually have to go through a regulatory process in order to open up in the US. And we've got some expertise in our team and some people we've got access to from our portfolio success stories who can help with that. So we take a sector by sector approach to that, but we believe it's critical to create, the very biggest global venture-backed successes. You pretty much have to be in the US ultimately if you're talking about software and data companies.
Totally. So, closing questions that we ask every single guest that comes to the podcast. Can you guys recommend a book or some form of content? And can you also suggest someone to invite to the podcast that hasn't been on before?
Yeah, I can go. So for a book, I'm going to say Shoe Dog. So very good. So yeah, the story of Nike. Yep. If you haven't read it, it's a very good one. And then to invite to the podcast, I'm going to suggest Patrick from Sanogenetics. They actually do their own podcast, so he's very rarely interviewed the other way around. So, and also I think in terms of some of the things we talked about, he'd probably be a good one for you guys to talk to.
Fantastic.
So I've been reading a book that I think kind of everyone's read by now, and maybe I'm coming up to it late, but which is Why We Sleep by Matt Walker, and it's changed how I think about, how are you successful in life. It's one of the components is sleeping well and regulating your body's kind of natural cycle and how that helps with cognition and memory. And I think it would make me a better venture investor to be a bit more on top of that than I am. So that's what I'm going to recommend.
Is that, Simon, why you have a Whoop?
Yeah, the Whoop is about, the book is about scaring me into sleeping better because I hear about all the terrible things that do. And the Whoop is about nudging me to go to bed earlier, basically.
Carrot and stick.
Carrot and stick. And then in terms of bringing someone into the podcast, one thing that we didn't talk about, but we talked about a little bit before, was this idea of kind of defense tech and dual use, and kind of, there's this whole American dynamism thing that A16Z is investing behind, and what about European dynamism? Excuse me. So I think it would be really interesting to bring on someone from the NATO Innovation Fund, which is a brand new €1 billion pot that's been created, and they've recruited a team. So there's Dr. Klaus Hummels who leads that, and there's some other interesting people in the team who I think would also be good on the podcast, and that would be quite an interesting topic, I think.
I was actually chatting to Chris from their team a couple of weeks ago, so this is a good reason for me to reinitiate Steer, to reach out with an invite.
Simon, Charlotte, thanks a ton. I think this has been great, and me personally, at least, I've learned quite a ton about what you guys do. So thanks a ton for your time.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much.
Brilliant. Thanks for having us, Jaime and Max.
Thanks. Bye.